We are simply delighted today to have a chance for a discussion with Ambassador Sullivan, who I'll introduce in just a moment. I'm Michael Kimmage, professor of history at Catholic University and a senior non-resident fellow at CSIS. I'll be joined as a moderator today by Hanna Notte, senior research associate at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. And our guest of honor today is Ambassador Sullivan, who has a number of current affiliations. He's a distinguished fellow at Georgetown University, has an affiliation with Columbia Law School, and is a contributor to CBS News, as well as having a sort of law firm association with Mayor Brown. So a man of many titles, but let me add two previous titles to the record, which are, of course, highly pertinent to today's discussion. And the first is Deputy Secretary of State, and the second is U.S. Ambassador to Russia during a very, very tumultuous period, really all around the world, 2000 to 2002. So, Ambassador Sullivan, I could go in great detail about your many achievements and accolades. I'm going to leave it at that just for purposes of time. Would like to thank the Carnegie Corporation for making this discussion possible, and also thank Altena Yunusova and Anna Vasilyeva for their support and assistance. And we'll note to our audience and to our participants, I suppose, that this is an event for the public record, and so nothing Chatham House or private about it. So with that, I would like to pass the baton to Hanna, and we'll have sort of 45 minutes or so of questions, and then I will invite the audience to send in its questions, which will then relate to Ambassador Sullivan. So thank you so much again for joining us, and Hanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael, and welcome, Ambassador. And I want to take us and the audience a little bit back into the past to start off the conversation, into the time that you served in Moscow. Now, with the recent ICC arrest warrant against Vladimir Putin, most observers are really hard-pressed to see any Western leaders meeting with the Russian president anytime soon. Now, I believe the last time President Biden met with Putin in person was at the summit in Geneva in the summer of 2021. I take it that you were in the room for that meeting. So can you talk to us a little bit about that meeting in the summer of 2021, what the US delegation took away from that meeting, including on sort of where the Russians were at that time, whether they were headed for war, and on the possibility of averting conflict?
Well, thanks, Hanna, and thank also, Michael, to you. That's less than 2 years ago, but to me, it seems like a lifetime ago. I was with President Biden when he traveled to Geneva in mid-June of 2021 to meet with President Putin. The meeting was in two parts. The first part was a 1+1, President Biden, Secretary Blinken, President Putin, Foreign Minister Lavrov. And then it expanded, and I joined the meeting along with Jake Sullivan and others, and the Russian side expanded as well. The meeting occurred after a spring in which U.S.-Russia relations continued their downward spiral. I started saying in early 2017, when I was confirmed as Deputy Secretary of State, in discussing U.S.-Russia relations, that we needed to stop digging the hole we were in, stop the downward spiral. And month after month, year after year, things just kept getting worse and worse. And it continued in the spring of 2001, after President Biden came to office. You'll recall that in March and April, the United States imposed sanctions on Russia over the Navalny poisoning and arrest. We basically caught up to what the EU was doing. We did that first in March, early March, as I recall. At some point in March, President Biden was interviewed by George Stephanopoulos, and in response to a question, agreed that President Putin was a killer. The Russian government did not react well to that. They withdrew their ambassador, Ambassador Antonov, from Washington. I stayed for another 6 weeks or so. And during the course of those 6 weeks, the United States imposed more sanctions on Russia for cyber intrusions, solar winds, election interference, et cetera. We expelled 10 more Russian diplomats, or what my Moldovan counterpart at Moldovan ambassador to the Russian Federation once said. They referred to undeclared Russian intelligence officers serving in diplomatic posts as multifunctional diplomats. We expelled 10 multifunctional diplomats from the United States, and we were in a very bad place. The Russian government, toward the end of April, asked me to leave. They didn't PNG me, but Ambassador Yushakov told me that I should really go home. I hadn't been home in 13 months at that point because of the pandemic. He said no Russian official would meet with me. And President Putin, in a phone call with President Biden, said the same thing. So it was the U.S.-Russia relations were in a bad place. Ukraine was a part of it. There was a military buildup in southwestern Russia in the spring of 2021. There was some disagreement within NATO about Russia's intentions, whether they actually would use the military that they were pouring into southwestern Russia to actually cross the border and make an incursion into Ukraine. I think the UK, among others, thought that was more likely than others did. So it was a fraught time, and President Biden thought it was appropriate to speak with President Putin to try to reduce tensions. And as we put it at the time, sort of put guardrails on the relationship to make sure that it didn't spiral out of control or get dramatically worse. Coming out of that meeting in Geneva, we had several work streams. One was on, we call them strategic stability talks. I'd been involved in them as deputy secretary, but beginning the discussion about what would the nuclear arms control architecture that would succeed the New START Treaty, which had been extended by the U.S. and Russia early in President Biden's term. We had a cyber dialogue, and we were also engaged in discussions with the Russians. I was involved on wrongfully detained Americans. Ukraine was discussed in Geneva, but the discussion on Ukraine was probably about as extensive as the discussion of Afghanistan. At that point, the President Biden had indicated that the U.S. would be withdrawing from Afghanistan. We were interested in getting bases in Central Asia, a post from which to conduct a counterterrorism mission, continuing it since we were going to lose our basing in Afghanistan. President Putin was not enthusiastic about that. But it was all in all, I think, as President Biden summed up in his press conference immediately after the meeting in Geneva, he didn't have hopes that we were going to make substantial progress on any of these issues, but everyone on the U.S. side agreed that it was in the U.S. interests to try to put some guardrails on the U.S.-Russia relationship that wouldn't allow it to spiral out of control. We had just scratched the surface of those dialogues when in October of 2021, late October, I happened to be home on leave when the U.S. intelligence community began reporting to senior leaders that there was an increasing buildup in the Russian military in southwestern Russia, in Crimea, with the intent to actually invade Ukraine. And that changed everything. All the other dialogues got pushed to the side. All the engagement between the United States and Russia, starting from the beginning of November when Bill Burns traveled to Moscow. I actually happened to be able to travel with him because I was in Washington on leave. When Bill traveled to Moscow to engage the Russian government, tell them what we saw they were planning to do and what the enormously catastrophic consequences for Russia would be if they went through with it. From that moment through February 24th, it was all about trying to stop what ultimately became the special military operation.
If I could go back just for a moment to the Geneva summit, and in my interpretation of the summit as an outsider, just as an observer, it seemed to be surprisingly positive. I'm thinking of the very civil tone of the two. It was not a simultaneous press conference, but the two separate press conferences. And of course, you've mentioned the working groups, strategic stability that came from it. It's a difficult question to answer, I'm sure, but I just wanted to ask, when you look back on it now, do you think it was, was in terms of Putin's intentions? I mean, was his mind open then, and was he looking for paths, or do you think his mind was maybe more made up than anybody could have guessed at the time? I know that we don't really have the evidence for it, but I'm just curious how, when you look back, how you see it at the moment.
Well, as I look back on it now, Michael, you're absolutely right about this aura. There was a pleasantness about the interaction. They smiled and shook hands, escorted by the Swiss president, with Lake Geneva in the background. It was a courteous and professional exchange. But to be fair to President Biden, if you go back and look at his press conference, he explained what we were trying to accomplish, but he would not say that he had any hopes that we were going to, despite the pleasantness of the engagement. That afternoon was a beautiful day in Geneva. Despite that, he would not say that he had hopes that we were going to accomplish anything from any of the dialogues that we had, that the two presidents had agreed on. My own personal perspective, looking back on it now and looking back over time to statements that President Putin has made, going back to his famous or infamous speech at the Munich Security Conference, and continuing forward to recent statements he's made. He was asked recently by a pro-Kremlin journalist, why didn't we do this in 2014? And I thought Putin's answer was revealing. He said, we weren't ready then. We needed time to get ready. We weren't ready economically. We needed to harden ourselves. And they had also invested a lot of money in their military and in their security services over that time. I am convinced that he was intent on achieving the goals of the special military operation, which, as they put it in their vernacular, are denazifying and demilitarizing Ukraine. We can talk about what that means. He was going to achieve it either by force of arms or by capitulation by the Ukrainians. And the clock was ticking in his mind. And he decided that late February 2022 was the right time to strike.
Sounds entirely convincing to me that the means were there and the ends were the things that he was searching. Excuse me, Hanna. Let me pass the baton. Yeah.
Just want to come back in here and ask you, Ambassador, given what you just said, what's your reading with hindsight on the diplomacy that still did take place in the winter of 2021 going into 2022, those quote unquote draft treaties that were put forward by the Russian Federation? Was there a real chance for diplomacy at that point? Do you believe your counterparts at the Russian MFA were engaged in a good faith effort to find a solution?
Absolutely, positively not. I have more chance, Michael and I are hockey fans, NHL fans. I have more chance of being the first line center for the Boston Bruins when they start the Stanley Cup playoffs than there was a chance that negotiations between the United States and Russia, or between NATO and Russia, were going to yield stop the special military operation. The only thing that would have stopped the special military operation was capitulation by Ukraine, giving up territory that Putin wanted. That's the only thing that would have stopped it. Now, why do I say that? I can give you, being there in the room when they presented the two draft treaties to us in Moscow, and listening in or seeing the transcripts of the phone calls between Biden and Putin, Secretary Blinken and Foreign Minister Lavrov, they just did not approach negotiations with a seriousness of purpose that I would have expected from an interlocutor that really wanted to engage in dialogue. For example, they handed us 2 draft treaties in mid-December. I believe it was a Wednesday. I'd have to check the calendar. It was around December 15th. The usual practice is when we exchange documents, our official language is English. We present a document in English and we provide as a courtesy a translation into Russian, which, by the way, as a footnote, the Russians delight in taking time out of a meeting to go over our Russian translation to point out what they say are mistakes in how we've translated this unofficial document. Their practice is to present us an official draft in Russian with an English translation. They handed me 2 documents in Russian, a treaty between the United States and Russia, a purported treaty between the United States and Russia, and a treaty between NATO and Russia. That was just a recapitulation of talking points, public statements by the Russian Federation over the last several months, if not several years, about security guarantees that Russia sought. Here's where the dynamics of the meeting were confirmed for me that they weren't serious. They handed me these 2 treaties and said, this is an urgent matter for us. These 2 draft treaties, we want to negotiate these two treaties in 48 hours in Geneva. And in 48 hours, we're going to make these 2 draft treaties public. So, that indicated to me, what it said to me was, you, Mr. Ambassador, and actually I was joined by my colleague, Karen Donfried, our Assistant Secretary for Europe. They were saying, you take these 2 draft treaties, which you've dropped in your lap and you haven't even had the courtesy to translate for you or President Biden or Jake Sullivan or Tony Blinken. You tell them they need to get a negotiating team together in 48 hours, travel to Geneva and prepare to negotiate these 2 documents, which we are then going to make public on Friday in 48 hours. No one who is serious about negotiations or diplomacy would have approached that situation in that way. That is one of many examples I can give you. There was no effort at serious diplomacy. No interlocutor, no other country, no country that was serious about diplomacy would have approached the United States in that way.
I have a follow-up question. I did want to ask our audience, anybody who has a question, please just send it into the chat function and we'll start gathering them to ask Ambassador Sullivan in sort of 20 or 30 minutes. But I have a follow-up question, which is just your personal impression, because it's been argued that this is sort of an old argument about Russian foreign policy, that the MFA and Foreign Minister Lavrov are not deeply in the loop, and the decision-making circles are elsewhere. That's maybe a general point, but it does seem to me plausible that when it came to the war, the MFA truly was out of the loop. They must have gotten some kinds of marching orders to do these draft treaties and have the sort of public display that came with that. But I'm curious if that was your impression as well. Of course, we know more than you could have known in December, but if you felt like they were just adrift and at sea.
So we'll put Foreign Minister Lavrov to one side and focus on my principal interlocutor as ambassador was Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov. If you ask me, my opinion, I don't think that he would have known before the special military operation began or that week in February what was going to happen. What had played out in November was, my recollection is that President Putin went and spoke to the senior leadership of the foreign ministry and charge, and Foreign Minister Lavrov was there, all of the deputy foreign ministers were there, and he charged the foreign ministry with coming up with, I don't know that he phrased it as a treaty, but a document that would set forth the security guarantees, and they used various permutations of ironclad, bulletproof, waterproof, childproof, whatever. Couldn't be varied from. We're going to have security guarantees that will never be breached, that we need for our security. And that was the task that was given to the MFA. And roughly 3 weeks later, they presented these two relatively short, I'm sure you've seen them, relatively short documents to me. Everything that happened right up to the point when the troops, tanks, helicopters, aircraft, and missiles crossed the border on February 24th. Everything that they had been doing up to that point could have been consistent with President Putin maximizing the advantage he had in negotiating with us and threatening armed conflict in Ukraine. At one point in late January or early February, I did a press conference with the virtually from Moscow with the press in the foreign press at the U.S. Press Center at NATO in Brussels, and it was on video. And I said something to the effect of, this is weeks before the special military operation. I said the Russians are approaching these negotiations with their military buildup and what they've done. At that point, they had moved substantial troops into Belarus, which was a very unusual and threatening development. I said, the Russians are approaching these negotiations, come to the negotiations, sat down at the negotiating table and put a gun on the table. The threat of their invasion of Ukraine, which is not unusual in how the Russian government has negotiated in the past. To get back to your question, Michael, if I had to guess, and it's pure speculation on my part, I don't believe that anybody at the MFA, including the foreign minister, had significant advanced knowledge of what President Putin was was going to do with Ukraine. For that matter, I believe there are also a number of people at the Ministry of Defense and in the FSB and in the security services who also didn't know. Foreign Minister Lavrov, though, is an important figure and shouldn't be underestimated. He's important to President Putin because he is, from the Russian government and I think from President Putin's perspective, a very effective advocate and public spokesman for Russia, for its position, and in defense of the special military operation. So I could imagine a situation in which he was apprised earlier so that he would be prepared immediately to defend and explain what was happening. Everybody else at the MFA, I'm pretty confident they didn't know, that it was going to be the type of large-scale military envelopment of Ukraine that we ultimately witnessed on the 24th.
So on the 24th of last year, the invasion starts. Afterwards, you actually stay on as U.S. ambassador to Russia for, I believe, a good 6 months until September of last year. Can you talk a little bit about how your job changed, your day-to-day job serving your country in Russia, in terms of constraints you were facing and so on? Well,
there were some changes. One large one, just a personal one that I had decided on was because of the pace of calls, video teleconferences, secure video teleconferences with Washington and the time difference, I needed to move on into a townhouse on the embassy compound so that I was available for secure communications or secure discussions with my colleagues at the embassy that I couldn't have if I continued to live in my residence at Spaso House. So I moved on to the compound, which was a change for me and something that Russians, particularly Muscovites, noticed. Spaso House is very well known, and the fact that I had moved out, I think, was noticed. There some speculation that I was concerned about my safety. I wasn't. In my 3 years, almost 3 years as ambassador, I never had concerns for my physical safety that were beyond what any American diplomat serving abroad would have. But the other thing that, so what didn't change though, Hanna, was, and you have to remember that the prior 2 years we'd been, I'd had fewer public events, fewer engagements in person with Russian government officials because of the pandemic. So my experience as ambassador was already different from what it might have otherwise been had there not been a pandemic and a lockdown that started in Moscow for a time early on in 2020, late March into, I think it was around June 10th of 2020 when they lifted the restrictions. It was vigorously enforced. And Russian government officials, I had no in-person meetings in the spring of 2020. Over the course of the remainder of the calendar year, I started to have a few more in-person meetings, and that continued through 2021. But I was already not as engaged physically in meetings with Russian government officials because of the pandemic. So I didn't notice a huge change after February 24th. There weren't regular large protests outside the embassy, for example. There were occasional protests, on a Sunday afternoon, a group of 50 or 75 people might show up for a brief choreographed demonstration that was videotaped, and then they'd get in their cars and disperse. They did rename they built a square, a little park near the embassy, and they changed our address to Donetsk People's Republic Square, I think. They originally were going to change it to Defenders of the Donbass Square, and I sent out a tweet that said, I'm delighted to be identified with those Ukrainians who are defending the Donbass from Russian aggression, and they realized that might be a mistake, so they renamed it to, I think it was Donetsk People's Republic Square, I should say, something like that. We had a continuing problem, but this was just a continuation of negotiations with the Russians over the operations of our embassy in Moscow and their mission to the United States. But I can't say there was a huge shift in my experience as ambassador after February 24th. The bigger shift was my engagement with Washington. And much of my communication with the Russian government was over the phone, by paper, occasional meetings. But again, that was consistent with how we've been doing business during the pandemic.
So I wanted to go back to something you said earlier, sort of your response to the question about the Geneva summit. And I think it's a very persuasive argument that Putin's ends when it came to Ukraine were set long before 2021 or 2022, and the means were a matter of improvisation and something that he was sort of working his way through. I want to ask you your perceptions of Putin, the person, sort of in the lead up to the war. And, people have speculated that the pandemic changed him. I actually think that may be true. Not that there's really certainty in those terms. He's not, the young man that he was, relatively speaking, when he took power in year 2000. He does have this sort of long legacy behind him, and sometimes that's put forward as an explanation for the war, that he wanted to secure his legacy and sort of write his way into history. It does feel like Putin has become less risk averse over time, which is not what you see with every political leader. But I wanted to ask you your views on that. I don't think anybody would want to reduce the war to Putin's psychology, but I think it's also impossible to say that Putin's psychology is not important to the wars. And so, given that you had a kind of unique seat in terms of observing that, I'm very curious of your views.
Well, I think his views over time, my tenure as ambassador, his views personally, and also what I believe are his views as reflected in the writing of his close confidant, the former director of the FSB and current secretary of the Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev. Their writings, Putin's historical article on the Great Patriotic War and the status of Ukraine, written in, I think it was July of 2021. I mean, this was something that, and Patrushev had been writing things like that for a substantial period before then. This was something that was really, he'd been chewing on for a long time, obviously, probably decades. But Michael, you hit on something. I mean, my perception of him, what little I knew about him, I thought he was, he was somebody who wanted to keep his options open until the very last minute. He was very much, it was consistent with, he was a judo enthusiast, still is. And of course, judo is a martial art in which, in large part, the participant uses the aggressive actions of his opponent against them, and leverages their weight, their motion, etc. He was somebody I thought who was my prediction before early November of 2021. He was someone who was going to leverage this situation with Ukraine to his advantage to achieve his objectives, which have never varied since February 24th: denazification, demilitarization of Ukraine. But boy, something in at least during my tenure as ambassador, his aggressiveness on this point ratcheted up, and he pushed all his chips into the center of the table on February 24th. He had confidence, and as did Patrushev and other senior leaders in that small group, had real confidence that and it's not just the Russian military. This is the Russian war doctrine. This is hybrid war, total war. And if any institution or organization failed, and certainly the Ministry of Defense did and the uniformed military did, but as great a failure as that, if not greater, was by the FSB, which was supposed to prepare the battle space and had years and huge amounts of money to prepare the battle space so that the military could, with 200,000 or fewer troops, envelop a large country. And that's a fraction of the troops by comparison, for example, that the Germans used when they invaded France in 1940, right? It's 1.4 million for a country roughly the same size with roughly the same population. Now, with a much larger army, the French army was supposed to be the best army in Europe at that point. But in any event, they were really, really confident on February 24th that they could accomplish the objectives of the special military operation. And that came through from the very first discussions that we had going back to Bill Burns's trip in early November to engage with them, they just gave off this confidence that what was going to happen in Ukraine was their business. It's their issue, which they're going to address. They denied that they had plans to invade, but whatever they were going to do, they were confident that they could take care of this situation in their interests. And they had plans, obviously, for a considerable period of time before the plans that were ultimately executed on February 24th. And he was massively mistaken about the capacity of his conventional military and the ability of Ukraine to resist, and the failure of the FSB to weaken Ukraine. And it's basically the same mistake Hitler makes in 1941. He says the Soviet Union is just a rickety old shack. All we've got to do is kick the door in and it will collapse. And that's basically what they thought would happen to Ukraine. And they were profoundly mistaken.
I will just add as a footnote that what you describe in terms of that confidence is, I think, for historians a very, very significant point and truly a very helpful one, because often the Russian rhetoric leading up to the war is one of encirclement and being sort of hemmed in, which would suggest sort of fear as a motive, and that may, for all I know, be true on some level. But I think this confidence is a much more persuasive way.
And the other thing, Michael, when you mention confidence, again, and I can't help making these World War II and drawing these World War II analogies just because Vladimir Vladimirovich is just so fond of invoking the great patriotic war to support what he's doing. But his attitude toward Ukraine, and we talk about his isolation and his confidence, he was being advised, I believe, in 2013-14 to be cautious, and particularly about Crimea, right? And his view then over time, after that, from his view, wildly successful undertaking, particularly with respect to Crimea, anybody who's telling him to exercise caution to the extent they knew or had the nerve to say so, his view to them would have been the same as Hitler's in 1940-41. His generals are telling him, be careful invading the Low Countries in France. They were wrong. Hitler, I was right. I am a military strategist, better than you. So when you come to me and tell me we should delay Barbarossa because of this problem we've got in Greece and delaying the forget it. I know what I'm doing. I'm going forward with this. I think all of that played into his isolation, his overconfidence about his own abilities, listening to his great press about what a great strategist he was. He's playing three-dimensional chess when the West is playing checkers. I think that all factored into it.
I do want to bring the conversation a little bit to the present day. And since we just mentioned confidence, Ambassador, the Russians also appear to be playing a game with nuclear arms control with a certain degree of confidence at the moment. President Putin suspended Russia's participation in the New START treaty a few weeks ago. I want to ask you what you make of that decision and where the Russians are really going with this. I mean, do you think they are prepared, confident that they can prevail in a new nuclear arms race with the United States if it comes to it?
So great question, Hanna. And, it's a very interesting part of his speech to the Federal Assembly, however many weeks ago it was now. I mean, it's added at the end, his announcement about New START. And in one sense, there's less than meets the eye, but in another sense, there's more than meets the eye. So there's less than meets the eye because basically the Russians had already suspended their participation in New START. So under the treaty, there's something called the Bilateral Consultative Commission. U.S. and Russian, the two sides are supposed to meet to discuss issues that arise under the treaty. And both sides have inspection rights under the treaty. Those processes had been suspended during COVID. And when we tried to reinitiate, as the pandemic, as the COVID restrictions were being relaxed, the Russian side resisted. And I think you'll find quotes from, among others, Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov saying, yet, no inspections, BCC is not going to meet. And he says things like, your hostility, the United States' hostility to Russia, as evidenced by the war that you, the United States, have initiated in Ukraine against us. No, we're not of a mind right now to allow U.S. inspections. By the way, you won't let our inspectors in, et cetera. Putin is basically saying the same thing. It's relaying that message through a megaphone by repeating it as president of the Russian Federation. And he puts it in a much harsher context in which he says he's not going to reconsider going back into compliance with the treaty until he considers, and the Russians consider, for example, France's and the UK's nuclear arsenal, which has got nothing to do with the New START treaty. But from a practical perspective, the BCC wasn't meeting, inspections weren't happening. This was just reaffirming what the Russians had already decided to do. There's more than meets the eye, however, because it's just another example of every opportunity he has. And I would cite the announcement over the weekend by him that they are going to deploy nuclear weapons to Belarus. Every opportunity he has to invoke and leverage Russia's nuclear arsenal against those opposed to the special military operation, he will use. They did that during the negotiations in the run-up to the war. I can't tell you how often, when I was engaged in a conversation with a senior Russian government official, the conversation would go from, as they used to say in the automobile commercials, from 0 to 60 miles an hour in the blink of an eye. We'd go from talking about the minutia of the Minsk agreements to, well, geez, if we don't work this out, it's the Caribbean crisis, which is what they call, we call the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's nuclear confrontation between the United States and Russia. And it's there's very little leverage that the Russians have, energy and their nuclear weapons, and some other things as well, their relationship with China, et cetera. He's going to use every tool possible. His statement about New START in the speech to the Federal Assembly is just another example. In fact, my recollection is, if you look at Russian pro-Kremlin, Russian social media commentators said after the fact that this was a more sophisticated and maybe effective and less offensive less chance of giving offense to Beijing form of nuclear saber rattling, just reminding us at every opportunity, as if we needed reminding, with former President Medvedev bringing up nuclear weapons and nuclear war almost on a daily basis. If you arrest President Putin with the, under the ICC warrant, we've got weapons that will wipe you off the face of the earth. It's what they do. It's how they negotiate. And that's his statement on New START in that treaty is of a piece with that.
So, Ambassador Sullivan, I'm going to turn now to two questions that have come in from our audience, and I will again ask the audience to send whatever they wish to send into the Q&A function or into the chat function if you prefer, and we'll be delighted to read them out. And so the first question comes from Alex Carlier, I hope I'm reading your name correctly, who's a major at UCOM, and asks, do you assess that the Russian Federation's position of influence is waning among global South countries? And Alex references the laughter at Foreign Minister Lavrov's recent sort of public event in India when he claimed that it was Ukraine that attacked Russia to begin the war. So sort of Russia and the global South.
I would not agree with that assessment. I think if there's been failure is too strong a word, but if there's been a weakness it's in U.S. diplomacy or in our in the results that we have obtained. It is a failure to convince the 141 countries in the General Assembly that voted to, this is the language, condemn and deplore the special military operation and require that Russia withdraw from Ukraine. So many of those countries just look the other way. It's a dispute. It's a territorial dispute. The U.S. and NATO are just as much to blame as Russia. I think it's what's allowed Putin to maintain the special military operation on the pace that he has and prevented the collapse of the Russian economy. Obviously, his dear friend in Beijing has been a big part of that. But the fact that India, Brazil, the other BRICS, South Africa, and the global South haven't, and many of those countries, by the way, abstained from that General Assembly vote. I think we've got a ways to go in trying to convince the global South that this is a global problem. A permanent member of the UN Security Council using brutal and brutal methods to basically decapitate an independent sovereign country. The notion that the Russian government could empty its prisons, tens of thousands of prisoners. There was an article, I think it was in yesterday's New York Times, and the Russians have commented about this, about Americans who have misbehaved in joining, foreign groups that are supporting the special military operation. This has not been organized by the United States government, and it's on a scale that's minuscule compared to the number of people who are participating in the violence in Ukraine. What's not minuscule, and is, if you think about it long enough and consider it, is really crazy, is that a sovereign country, Russia, and permanent member of the Security Council, has released tens of thousands of prisoners. What population in Russia is the least likely to abide by rules and regulations, the most likely to commit war crimes? It's prison population. And use them in human wave attacks in another country, in Ukraine. And we talk about this as if it's normal. That level of brutality is something that hasn't seeped in to the discussion. And we've got to add to it the war crimes, the abduction of the children, for which Putin is now subject to an arrest warrant, attacks on civilian infrastructure, the tens of thousands of innocents who have been killed, the almost 15 million people, either refugees or internally displaced. The level of brutality here by a permanent member of the Security Council is something that every country, not just NATO allies, not just the EU, not just Japanese Prime Minister Kishida, going to visit a mass grave in Bucha, to his credit, on the day when President Xi of China is in Moscow, slapping the back of his good friend, now indicted war criminal, Vladimir Putin.
So there's one other question from the chat, and then Hanna, I know that you have other questions. So maybe Hanna will turn to you first, since this is from the same person, the chat question. Please, Hanna.
I had actually a question which I would combine with the question that came in through the chat, Michael. Wonderful. Ambassador, let me ask you, given everything you just laid out, we are in a situation where we have very limited high-level direct contact between the US and Russian governments, given what's going on in Ukraine. But how do you assess that situation of no contact? Are there dangers inherent in it that need to be dealt with, or is it just appropriate to the situation? And I want to read out the question by Alex, which sort of builds on that. He asks, what limitations do you assess the US has now with managing escalation? You mentioned that in 2020 and 2021, we were working on guardrails with the strategic stability talks, but now escalation management is mainly one-sided.
So I mean, that's among the problems with President Putin in his statement on the New START treaty. Even after the Warsaw Pact invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968, roughly the same size military incursion, 200,000 Warsaw Pact troops, not necessarily Soviet or Red Army. Much different outcome in Czechoslovakia. I mean, they did, in fact, decapitate the government. Dubček sent back to Moscow. Even then, into the 70s, continuing through the incursion into Afghanistan, the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in nuclear arms control discussions. The notion now that the Russian government is going to say no to the Bilateral Consultative Commission, no to inspections under the New START Treaty. It's the whole point of the New START Treaty is that when things get really bad and there's a war in Ukraine and we've got Russian flankers, Su-27 aircraft taking out, $32 million U.S. surveillance drones, that's the very moment when we do need to have discussions and engagement with the Russian government under the New START Treaty and elsewhere on those high-level issues. So I believe, I haven't been a party and I'm no longer in the administration, haven't been for 6 months. There are channels for the United States to communicate with the Russian government. Bill Burns has been used by President Biden, former ambassador to Russia, former deputy secretary of state, current director of the CIA, has engaged with his counterpart, the head of the SVR, Narishkin. But there are other points of contact, whether it's Ambassador Yushakov at the Kremlin, Mr. Patrushev, the secretary of the Security Council. It's going to be difficult, though, for a president, any Western leader, not just to meet with, but to speak with Vladimir Putin, right? He's now got subject of an arrest warrant issued by the ICC. He's credibly accused of committing war crimes on a massive scale against innocent children. And I remember my experience as deputy secretary in trying to engage with Sudan to bring Sudan back out of the the crushing burden of U.S. sanctions. Sudan wanted to re-engage with the United States, with the West. The fact that the president of the country, Bashir, was subject to an ICC arrest warrant meant I couldn't speak to the president when I visited Khartoum. No U.S. leader would. So it's a very challenging situation, Hanna. There are means for us to communicate, but imagine the next call, and there may very well be one. I don't know when, between an American president and President Putin, but that American president is going to be speaking with a war criminal. And that was not the case with Nixon and Brezhnev, Reagan and Brezhnev, Reagan and Gorbachev.
I can't help but pointing out from your the comments that you've made, and you've mentioned him twice today. Ambassador Burns titled his memoirs "The Back Channel," and it seems to me like he's going to have to write a second volume of those memoirs because, in a way, that story was only beginning with his career. I think he published the book
absolutely
4 or 5 years ago, and hopefully he'll share with the with the world one day all of the work that he's doing at the moment. There's another question from the chat, which is as difficult as they come, and I'm sure you've been asked it in other settings. This from Alexander Titov, who asks, how do you see the war ending? So it's maybe the $1 million question, you could say, and there it is.
Well, I can quote my former superior in the last administration, Secretary/General Mattis, and his predecessor, Secretary Gates. I was speaking with them some weeks ago, and someone asked them that question, and it was Secretary Gates with Secretary Mattis nodding vigorously in agreement. Anybody who tells you they know how this war is going to turn out doesn't know what they're talking about. And I who am I to disagree with those two observers of this? What I will say is, at this point, I agree, as I have during my entire tenure, as I did during my entire tenure in the Biden administration, with Secretary Blinken on his approach to Russia and President Putin. President Putin has no interest in any negotiations. They always say, of course, we're interested in negotiation, but there is never the slightest step back from the claims. And Mr. Peskov usually steps in and says, well, you got to accept facts on the ground. Facts are facts. We control this territory. We have a large nuclear arsenal. What are you going to do to us? Kind of. But there is no interest on the Russian side in negotiating a durable resolution, even along the lines of, people have made comparisons to the Korean conflict, and which is still not subject to a peace treaty, and creating a demilitarized zone in eastern Ukraine. The Russians aren't prepared to discuss that. And I remember joking, this is a while ago now, with Secretary Blinken. We were kept being asked, what's the off ramp? What off ramp are you going to offer President Putin? And my response to that was, he doesn't want an off ramp. And if we want to use a highway analogy, and for those of you who have heard me speak on this topic before, please pardon me if I'm repeating myself, but if we want to use a highway or a turnpike analogy, like on the New Jersey Turnpike, he'd take the Vladimir Vladimirovich rest area, but he doesn't want an off-ramp. He wants to, he'd take a rest area, he'd take a ceasefire to re-equip, regroup, get artillery shells from North Korea, drones from Iran, press more people into service, maybe further conscription. But he is never going to surrender the two goals of the special military operation, which are denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. He's just not. And anybody who thinks he is whistling past the graveyard. That is just not in his DNA. It's not the way he operates. He will not do it. On the other hand, President Zelensky, has no room to negotiate either. He doesn't want to surrender Ukrainian territory in return for an ephemeral peace that will really be continued violence and ultimately this lingering threat from Russia. He doesn't want to do it. And by the way, even if he did, he wouldn't stay as president because the Ukrainian people don't want that. So neither side is looking to negotiate. And I don't see in the foreseeable future any situation in which either side, both sides, even with credible mediators, and who those might be, God only knows, coming together to discuss a durable ceasefire and peace.
So, I very much appreciate what you say about the language of diplomacy. We've had now a couple of, I guess you could say, failed metaphors. The reset, I wouldn't say it was a complete failure, but it didn't reset maybe enough. The guardrails didn't contain, whatever the vehicle was that Putin was driving, and the off ramp has been used for 6 or 7 or 8 years, and it's really I couldn't agree more with your advice to retire it and get rid of it. It's interesting that Kennan, comes up with containment, which is the strategic frame for U.S. policy for 40 years, and it's not a metaphor. It's just a sort of a coherent set of actions, and maybe we need to remind ourselves of that when we think about coming up with a strategy for the next couple of years. With that in mind, and I want to modify one of the questions that came in on the chat and ask about, obviously your diplomatic work took you very often to Russia, but I don't think that there's a way for an American diplomat to work on Russia without also working on Europe. And, there's the U.S.-Ukraine relationship, which is robust and doing well, but complicated. There's the U.S. relationship with Poland and the Baltic republics, which is robust but complicated. But there's also the U.S.-EU relationship and the U.S.-German relationship, U.S.-French, U.S.-British, not to mention the countries of Southern Europe, which are, I think a bit more distant from the the war than other countries in Europe. When you think of U.S. diplomacy at the moment, what priorities might you set for sort of managing all of these relationships? Because it does seem to me that sort of U.S. success over the long term is going to have a lot to do with this alliance maintenance and sort of keeping these countries on board.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Michael. And just give you my perspective from Moscow. I was back in February of 22. In early February, I was convinced almost to a moral certainty that Russia was going to engage in a large-scale reinvasion of Ukraine. I had no expectation that the Ukrainian government was going to be able to resist what we expected to be a Russian onslaught by a much more capable and organized military supported by equally large and capable security services. But even more so was I skeptical that we were going to be able to maintain unity among NATO allies and other countries across Europe and like-minded allies and partners, including in the Pacific, Japan, South Korea. I'm not sure which is the bigger surprise to me. Both, I suppose the Ukrainian resistance has to be, from my perspective, the bigger surprise. The fact that in the days after the special military operation began, the President Zelensky stayed, not only rallied Ukrainians, but rallied Europe. Those were riveting moments that I think really, historians like yourself will look back and think about the impact that he personally had. So maintaining alliance unity is going to be an ongoing challenge for the United States, something that my former colleagues, Assistant Secretary Donfried, who actually just announced last week that she is resigning soon, which I'm sorry to see, but 2 years of doing this is stress enough for anybody, I suppose. But it's not just Europe. I mean, you think about and we can get into the bigger picture of Russia and China and Japan now, and what the Japanese have done. The recent visit, as I mentioned earlier, by Prime Minister Kishida to the Kyiv and to Bucha, visiting mass graves, scene of a war crimes, documented. If you've seen that, the New York Times has done a fantastic job of documenting the war crimes in Bucha and identifying particular Russian units and individuals with the crimes that were committed. So a surprise that Europe was as united from the start. I attribute that in part to Zelensky electrifying, in some sense, European capitals and the EU with what he did in the immediate aftermath of the invasion. But it's a constant effort for diplomats at the State Department and across the U.S. government, including the U.S. military, at NATO, et cetera.
Thank you so much. I mean, Hanna, I think that we sort of near gradually the end of our time, so I'm not sure if you would want to ask a last question or two, and then we can gradually begin to wrap up.
Sure. I have another question, which I'll again integrate with a question that came in through the chat from Ginger Thompson. Ambassador, it seems to me that given this acrimony between Western states and Russia over this war, one of the interesting features that has emerged is what I'd call new intermediaries. I mean, Turkey stepped up soon to host these initial talks between the Russians and the Ukrainians last spring. Since then, they have facilitated this grain deal. The UAE and Saudi Arabia have played a role in facilitating prisoner exchanges. And first of all, I want to ask you, what's your assessment of this? Is this, from the United States point of view, just a positive thing? It's a good thing that they're doing this? Or does that come with its sort of own issues and considerations from a US point of view? And then to tag on to that question, I want to ask you from Ginger Thompson, whether you see any prospect for alternative players, so not state players, but other players, to sort of play any positive role between Russia and Ukraine going forward?
So on the first question, Hanna, I guess I would put on my lawyer's hat and give a very a typical lawyer response to that type of question, which is, it depends. So the grain deal, I think is the U.S. would consider very positive step. There are other aspects of Turkey's relationship with Russia that are less so. And you mentioned prisoner exchanges. These are, positive, but as important as they are to the individuals and the families involved, peripheral. I don't see at this point a non-state, whether it's some sort of multilateral organization or institution, that steps into the void. And while I'm on the topic, I've mentioned a couple of times the fact that Russia is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. What has this war done to the effectiveness of the UN? We've got these UN General Assembly votes lopsided against Russia, but with no teeth, because any action under Chapter 7 by the Security Council is blocked by Russia and its what Russia considers its unlimited partner. Chinese, I think that there may be some limitations to it. But contrast this, for example, with 1990, August 1990. Saddam wages an aggressive war against Kuwait, invades Kuwait. He's got a dispute with the Kuwaitis. He's in debt after his disastrous war with Iran. He's got an oil dispute over the huge oil field in southern Iraq that extends into Kuwait. He's got disputes with Kuwait, and he decides to settle that dispute by taking over. My recollection is he characterized it as Iraq's 19th province. And what happened? Then President Bush, George H.W. Bush, builds a coalition, but bolstered by votes by the UN Security Council, including by not only the People's Republic of China, but the Soviet Union, that authorized the creation of this large coalition and ultimately authorized the use of military force to expel Iraq from Kuwait, so that this naked aggression, this aggressive war, which was charged, the first crime charged at Nuremberg was to the principal Nazi defendants was crimes against peace. And the principal Nazi defendants, von Ribbentrop, Keitel, Jodl, they all hanged. They were convicted of crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy to commit the first three. That idea that a nation state can't wage an aggressive war of conquest against another country was reaffirmed by the Security Council in 1990. And now the Security Council, God knows when it will ever go back to being that type of check, a naked aggression by a country against another for a territorial land grab.
Well, Ambassador Sullivan, I think this is a good moment to draw our conversation to a conclusion. We simply wanted to thank you for taking the time to join us and to underscore how grateful we are to your insights about the future and the present moment. And I think it's very clear to me as a historian that your recollections of the Geneva summit and the lead up to the war are in and of themselves of great value to an understanding of this event that we've been discussing, the terrible war that we've been discussing over the past 75 minutes. So just by way of conclusion, I did want to mention some upcoming Monterey Conversations in the next couple of weeks. Ambassador Sullivan will be having somebody who must in some way be seen as a colleague of yours, Rose Gottemuller, also sort of fellow policymaker, who will be speaking to us about arms control. We'll have the journalist Valerie Hopkins, Andrew Roth, joining us, and scholars Michael Gordon and Asif Siddiqui to speak about the sort of space program, and I think there will be a few other Monterey Conversations upcoming. With that, let me thank again the Carnegie Corporation of New York for its generous support, Altanay Yunusova and Anna Vasilyeva for making everything possible, most of all, and I'd like to thank my co-moderator Hanna Notte as well, but most of all, I would like to thank Ambassador Sullivan for his sort of great generosity and really crucial insights into these issues.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Hanna. It was my pleasure to chat with you today, and look forward to continuing this conversation at some point in the future.
So do we very much.